Yeah, let's go.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Technical issues as always. Welcome to Verb. We are really proud to have Alexander Bard with us. We will spend a couple of minutes telling you what Verb is about. Juan Pablo. Afterwards, Roberto will tell you about Alexander, and then Alexander will take it from there for about half an hour.
A pleasure to have you here, Alexander. And thank you for the courage to being our guinea pig here in Burp, to be our first guest here. It's been fortunate having met you a bit of a year ago in India. So let me tell everybody what Burb is about, or what we're trying to do here. Burb is an experiment. It really starts with three friends that basically met at a young age at school. Each one took a different path. One in philosophy, the other one in engineering and management, and the third one in economics and finance. And after decades, we have got together, finding that we have similar questions, each one trying to answer them from different perspectives, but really not a lot of spaces to cross pollinate and eventually use what we know from different angles. So Burb is this space we're trying to create, in which we want to the context of Latin America and see if we can ask better questions, better answers, and eventually better action. And we're trying to build this on three main hypotheses or premises. One is that multiple perspectives is probably much better than one. I think it's widely documented that we're full of blind spots and biases. And the only way to really overcome them is if we look from different angles. So that's one. The second one is that really what we're facing is much more deeper than really a technology or an environmental revolution. And I think Alexander has written extensively about this, that we really are basically facing challenges that need to address our mental plumbing in terms of what are our mindsets and understand what really generated these problems. And obviously, paraphrasing the famous Einstein quote, we really cannot solve them if we really don't understand the mindset that really created those problems. So that's two. And the third is that even if we have this multiple lenses and we have, what is Verb? Verb is this space we're trying to build, this community we're trying to build, in which we want to take these ideas, mindsets from wherever they come, disciplines of geography, take them out from the silos and put them to dance and basically see what comes out of that remix, with kind of a view that we can get a better version, I don't know, a better mental programming. We play with this idea of version beta, and that's what the name Burp really comes from in the genesis, to see if we can, in the context of Latin America, try to get out our traps and eventually avoid wasting so much potential. So thank you for everybody for being here. This is where we start. We hope that you accompany us in this journey. We apologize for the glitches and the delays at the beginning. We're learning through this. We're not really any experts in this, and we're trying this new mediums and new technologies. We're obviously speaking in English, just to have minds of the caliber of Alexander, which Robert is going to present right now. But the idea is that we're trying to create this better pictures, this better toolbox. So, having said that, I'll pass it to Roberto, so Roberto can present Alexander formally. Thank you very much, everybody, and Alexander.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'm wearing my headphones. Thank you. So, thank you, Alexander, for being here. I met Alexander about a year ago in Rajasthan in India. And let me tell you a little story. I feel that we hit it off right away. Usually, when you meet, for example, the author of a novel you're reading, it's not so fun, but meeting philosophers is almost always fun. Be it the case that they are silent introverts or that they are very energetic intuition pumps. I think Alexander is of the second type, a very energetic intuition pump. He looks at you straight in the eye while he strokes his beard, sometimes like Pai Mei, the legendary master of the eagle claw technique in Kill Bill. And Alexander, you've always reminded me a little bit of Pai Mei. If you recall the movie, Pai Mei taught Beatrix the fatal movement known as the five-palm exploding heart technique and the 3-inch punch, which let her get out of the coffin. I felt the fatal effect of such techniques on my own feeble cognition system while trying to come up with something that could impress, who has become for me an enlightenment and discovery only paralleled by Byung-Chul Han and Slavoj Zizek. Let me tell you a little bit about Bard. Since then, I have no doubt about it, Alexander Bard is a shaman, or at least the possessor of a shamanic personality. Such type of personality, according to his own definition, belongs to those that come out of the forest, not so much to tell us that they know more than us, but to ascertain that they see things differently. So let me begin by trying to speculate out of what kind of forest Alexander emerges. One could mention the forest of his native Sweden, but of course, Alexander's forest is mainly a digital one. Bard believes we find ourselves in a transitional stage between capitalism and informationalism, a paradigm shift that basically is triggered by a new media technology, the internetization of humans and society, in which information and attention replaces capital as the paradigm's fundamental concept. I hope I'm getting this right. And if books are a mysterious type of internet made out of trees, as Peter Griffin's dog, Brian, in Family Guy once put it, Alexander also knows well this kind of forest of paper. He is the author of 5 books, The Netocrats, The Global Empire, The Body Machine, Syntheism, Creating God in the Internet Age, and Digital Libido, Sex and Violence in the Network Society. That he sees things differently, the other trait that belongs to a shaman. There's no doubt about it. I think that Bard is a radical process philosopher, merging Hegel and Nietzsche with Whitehead and Deleuze, using human beings as the constant and technological disruption as the variable, while working possible understanding of human history. And I will end my presentation with this. Today's topic, according to Alexander, will be centered on Latin America. No, of course, but the idea of proposing that change in a society that has no real has not really, undertaken any of the steps toward progress might happen only partially or might not happen at all, and that we must thus jump paradigms, that is insightful. As the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn once put it, real revolution comes only as a paradigm shift. Let us learn then how to get out by punching the with only a minimum space of elbow room. Welcome, Alexander, and we are eager to listen to you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I think when it comes to territory, that's the easy part for human beings when it comes to orientate ourselves in the world we live in. That means here's our territory, this is our tribe. There's another territory in the other valley, it's another tribe. And eventually, during civilization, especially over the last 5,000 years, we have struggled as human beings in trying to contain larger populations in larger areas. This is territorialization, as Gilles Deleuze calls it. So that means that maybe one day the two tribes don't need to go to war with one another any longer, but they can actually at least temporarily settle for peace, trade with one another. The daughter of one valley might marry the son of the next valley. And these are the hopes that eventually made us create the first, actually, the empires, and later also the smaller nations within those empires that we now call cultural civilization. The territory is the easy part here in the sense that we're so aware of it. We orientate ourselves in the spatial domains that way. What we tend to underrate always when we try to understand ourselves and the conditions we live in is actually the temporal dimension. Now, of course, Martin Heidegger famously stressed this when he wrote Being and Time. The title of his great book that he started his career with speaks volumes in this department. And prior to Heidegger, the philosophical revolution that occurred in Europe in the 19th century, especially in Germany, started with Hegel, moving on to Nietzsche, and then on to Heidegger, was very much a revolution of time and process at the center of human activity, instead of territory and space. We have only just begun to understand the significance of that revolution. It is a massive mind shift. So what does that mean? It means that when we try to orientate ourselves in time, we tend to look for solutions around us, and human beings are very good at mimicking one another. And we seem to be content with the fact that if we are into models that existed about 100 years ago, we're probably better than our neighbor that we compete with, because the people in the other valley tend to use a model that's 200 years old to understand the times we live in. So if you're going to look at the advantages from a more competitive perspective, it would actually make sense to focus more on the time than on the space. Because when it comes to mimicking in the spatial, we probably just look at the next valley down the road, and then we try to do whatever they do, and then we try to hide what we possibly do better from them. And that's essentially how you run a company, for example. But when it comes to looking at the temporal dimensions, it gets much more dramatic. The first thing that Thomas Kuhn rightly stressed, and Marshall McLuhan before him, was that when we look at revolutions, dramatic changes throughout history, human beings constantly overrate their own ideas. What actually happens when something dramatic happens in history is that there is first a major change in our surroundings. Yeah, it could be nature itself that changes. Certainly climate change has happened many times in history, and we try to adjust accordingly. And when we look at over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, the period we essentially call civilization itself, then it turns out that technological change has always been at the forefront. Actually, when we look at our own genes and the way we operate as human beings, we're still the same tribal creatures that we were 10,000 years ago. As a matter of fact, we are almost identical to the people who lived 200,000 years ago. Because human beings, at least until very recently, when we started using CRISPR technology, could not change ourselves at all. We could even make the statement without too much pomposity, and we try to understand history and try to understand the point in time we live at right now. It turns out that we can use human beings as the constant. We do not change at all. I know that there are a lot of women out there, especially beautiful women in Latin America, who have the ambition to breed children that are smarter than their own parents were. But then they get drunk on vodka or tequila on a Friday night, and they go to bed with the wrong guy anyway, and they give birth to the same old babies all over again. This is what happens throughout history all the time. Maybe for the better, to be honest about it. I don't think eugenic experiments have been very successful either. So if we admit that our children are really not any smarter than we are, and we are certainly not any smarter than our parents were, which is kind of a forgiving character here, that means that human beings can be used as a constant when we try to understand the times we live in. Okay, so what is it that changes them? Technology. We have been innovative. We've been innovating for the past 5,000 to 10,000 years. And it turns out that the biggest innovations that have had the most dramatic effects on ourselves and the societies we live in have been information technologies. So this wasn't just that I discovered the internet in the 1980s and that this became the reason why I wanted to become a philosopher one day to understand the times I live in. I simply realized that the internet was an excellent opportunity to say things that Hegel and Nietzsche and Heidegger could never have said, because they could never have imagined that we would one day create a spider web that united all of humanity, and through satellites above our heads, uniting the entire planet simultaneously, synchronically, meaning that we're all now connected and that space has virtually disappeared. We're all talking to each other now in real time. Even kids sitting in New Zealand can play computer games with kids sitting in Norway on the other side of the planet in real time. That means space has more or less disappeared. And still human beings insist that territorial divisions are important to them? I beg to differ. Technology has changed that forever. The problem, though, is that the internet has created a society where we're basically given a megaphone, it's called a smartphone, to just about 7 or 6 billion people on the planet, now approaching 8 billion people, including our kids, meaning everybody on the planet has the megaphone in their hand, which they have never learned how to use, meaning they shout at each other constantly, and we get things like Instagram, where the vast majority of people who join the forum post pictures of cats and babies until they all get sick and tired of it and kill the whole forum in the process. This was called MySpace 20 years ago. I came from the music industry. I knew then that the vast majority of people who would love to be a rock star have no talent whatsoever towards ever becoming a rock star, meaning that MySpace was quickly filled with 99.9% junk. A few years after MySpace was created, which was essentially a Ponzi scheme, where American people, especially Americans, tried to pretend that they were listening to each other's shitty music, although nobody really cared, then MySpace died, and we had to return and invent things like Spotify, where actually only talented musicians distribute their music, and we all listen to the same old hit songs we always did. So this is coming back to remind us that even if digital first gave us the hope that we would all be interested in listening to one another, we've actually created a world where if you would take, say, a theater stage and a theater audience and start looking at it, it's like we attempted to convince the entire audience that this was their time to shine, and the entire audience went up on the stage, and suddenly there were 8 billion people on the stage screaming at the top of their lungs to each other all the time, with nobody left in the audience. This means that if God was still around, in case he is, he'd probably be terribly bored with the internet, because we'd probably expect him to sit all day long and like all the mediocre junk that we human beings put out there, because we don't know what we're doing. That means the best bet today is to go into something that I, as a philosopher, call paradigmatics. And let me dare to use my own Spanish and call it paradigmáticas or something like that in probably Latin American Spanish. That's a good attempt, right? The paradigmáticas or paradigmatics is essentially this. It's the art of trying to understand the very times you live in. So rather than living with old models that have been redundant for over 100 years, try to orientate yourself, reorientate yourself in the current environment. Try to understand that the vast majority of people who go online use technologies in all the wrong ways and for all the wrong reasons, not knowing what they're doing. It's not like we have any academies around that can teach us what the internet is, because we're still just discovering this. The only thing we know is that if we go back to ourselves and try to understand more and deeper what it means to be human, before we even start to contemplate what the relationship between human beings and other human beings through technology might mean, we're not going to get the paradigmatics right. We've had these revolutions in the past, and that's the best place to start. To begin with, I always like to address the women in the audience and ask them if they know the difference between human beings and apes. And I think women are good at it because they usually know the difference, because when a man gets drunk in a bar on a Friday night, he starts behaving like an ape. An ape essentially goes, right? Whereas the human being, even if he's rude and drunk on tequila and rum, will probably try to say something. But as soon as you use spoken language, you become human. What makes Homo sapiens distinct as a species, and the reason why we create these large tribes that we did, uniquely among animals, is exactly the recipe for our success. We created spoken language society, and we lived in it for almost 200,000 years until we invented written language. And written language came around some 5,000 years ago. It was first used by the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. And one day, some fat old lady discovered that she could actually sit down and refuse to be nomadic, and people would stay with her because they had and taming plants. We created civilization itself. We then started writing down information, which means that we could store inside of our own brains for the first time ever in history. Before that, the oldest people of the tribe were the most valuable because they had all the wisdom, because everything had to be memorized. Once we had written language, we didn't have to memorize any longer. We can build huge libraries and store all the knowledge of the world. Not that we got the paradigmatics very right anyway. And when a Christian lynch mob stormed into pagan Alexandria, that should be a warning example to us how important it is to understand paradigmatics, to understand the internet now, before we start making tons of mistakes that might set back civilization rather than proceed it. So after written language, we invented the printing press. And this is where my little continent, Europe, was lucky. Europe is, and only deserves, I should be adamant about, to be very marginal in world history. But because the printing press was invented in Germany, well, it's actually invented in China, but China didn't have enough paper to print on in their printing presses. And they also had some dictators around, like they do today, unfortunately, that stopped the technology from being developed. But since nobody in Europe understood what they would do with the printing press except printing tons of Bibles on different languages they invented, basically the spoken dialects in various parts of Europe, so they didn't have to read the Bible in Latin or Greek, but they'd actually read in your local tongue. Imagine that for South America, if you could read the Bible both in Chilean and Ecuadorian and Mexican Spanish at the same time. That's essentially what happened in Europe after 1450. And when you get to the 17th century, and books became so affordable that the average price of a handwritten book that had been about $150,000 per book had fallen to about 30 cents. There were a lot of books around. You could fire the monks and the nuns who'd read the books to you at night because you discovered you could read the book loudly to yourself. You discover you didn't have to read the book loudly to yourself. You could read it quietly to yourself at night with a little lamp. And what then happened in Europe in the 17th century was spectacular. Finally, a new paradigmatics arrived called the Enlightenment. Because there were thousands of people around who could read their own books, have them printed at very low cost, and have them printed in large quantities, new ideas were widely distributed across Europe. Now, please note here that France and Germany and the United Kingdom got all of this right. And that's exactly what those countries, together with Spain and Portugal before them, basically conquered the world. They conquered 3 different continents. And whether we like what they did or not, it's beside the question here. This is all about the success of adapting yourself to a new paradigmatics. Europe quickly got adjusted to the idea that if you could distribute knowledge quickly on massive scales using printing presses, you created an entire different society from anything in the past. Now, the irony is that the most powerful culture in Europe, the Ottoman Empire, was precisely the one that saw this as a major problem and banned printing presses altogether. I should remind you that Turkey then went from being the wealthiest and most successful culture in Europe to by far the poorest and most problematic today. That's exactly what happens when you don't get the paradigmatics right. So, Europe conquered 3 further continents, basically populated them. Thankfully, in Latin America, enough of the indigenous population was left to create fantastic fusional merger cultures like Mexico and Peru, my favorite countries in Latin America. And I'm still grateful for that until today. And then also paradigmatic cultures could be mixed. That's exactly why Latin America has fantastic potential today. But moving forward, we move all the way to the French Revolution in 1789. The paradigmatics has not become conscious yet. Subconsciously, they operate. These are the ideas of the French Revolution, coming out of the European Enlightenment, but it leads to bloody massacres and misery. Until Napoleon comes along in the early 19th century and realizes, as the first warlord ever, that if I actually foster an army where everybody, including the cannon fodder itself, can read and write, I'll beat the shit out of everybody else. And so we did. And we got the Napoleonic idea for how to structure human relations. These were the bureaucracies that became the nation states of Europe in the 19th century, that inspired lots of Latin Americans to rebel against the Spanish and the Portuguese and declare their own independence and create the current nations of Latin America today. They were modeled on the Napoleonic idea that if you distribute the capacity to read, write, and count over a large population, hopefully to 100% of them, you will create enormous wealth in the process. Wealth that we can then argue about how well we distribute or not, but that's exactly what we did in the entire Western world. This leads us up to the end of the 20th century. Radio and television arrived. But did they really change the paradigmatics? No, they never did, because the Napoleonic structure stayed in place. The Napoleonic structure required that there must be a Napoleon at the top of the organization. That could be Dr. Napoleon at a hospital. That could be Napoleon in charge of a state bureaucracy. This could be Professor Napoleon in charge of an academic institution. This could be the entrepreneur Napoleon who starts a corporation, invents patents, and sells products and services to the rest of the world. It didn't matter, but the Napoleons of the West, through the different institutions they created, through the bourgeoisie that run the companies, through the academics that became the new priests who dictated the new truths of society called science, and through mass media that gave the word to the people and told them what they should think and how they should behave and created the opinions of the political arena that was there all along. All these different institutions, industry, academies, the state, mass media, all these institutions came out of the Napoleonic structure. That was only enhanced by radio and television. You saw this clearly in Latin America. Because in a culture with a weak middle class, a large working class coming out of slavery, more or less, and a new noble upper class that basically exported raw materials to the rest of the world, you got what we since called the curse of Latin America. The curse of Latin America was with capitalism and industrialization of the West. Latin America was left behind because it had a weak middle class. Therefore, it had an upper class that wasn't held responsible by the population. That led to dictatorship after dictatorship. And it led to kind of Latin American power dinner. You would expect it every weekend, that the dictator of politics and the dictator of academics and the dictator of industry would sit down with their different ladies and have a dinner together and basically decide how to run affairs in Paraguay or Ecuador or Nicaragua or any other country you would like to pick from Latin America. Basically running raw material-driven economies. So this was Latin America coming out of the industrial age and out of capitalism. Radio and television, remind you there, only enhanced this process. There's no reason at all why this process should be interfered with. I taught organization theory at the Stockholm School of Economics already in the late 1980s, and the only model you would still teach for anybody to run a successful organization of any kind would be the Napoleonic model. But then the internet came around, and this was the game changer. So what happened with the internet was this. The Napoleonic structure essentially started dissolving from underneath. The cannon fodder of the Napoleonic army started talking directly to one another. They didn't know what they were doing. Nobody figured out the paradigmatics of the internet, except that this was radically different from newspapers or radio or television. No, people started talking directly to one another, and eventually we got fantastic things like Wikipedia and far less interesting things like Instagram that came out of the internet revolution. But we all went online. And here's the important lesson. The internet was not a capitalist phenomenon, because it quickly became obvious that this was a phenomenon that tried to swallow all of humanity within itself by operating increasingly towards zero cost. How much does it cost you today to open a Gmail account? Zero. How much does it cost you today to open a Facebook account? Zero. How much does it cost you today to go online? Virtually zero. You probably get some kind of a telecom subscription. In India, at least, they are incredibly cheap, meaning any Indian can afford them. That means that the internet was something you would get into your hand as a smartphone as soon as you could pay for anything in your life. If I go to Africa today, before people even have running water or electricity, they will have these machines. Why? Because they feel empowered. But it's a mass empowerment. It's 8 billion people all being empowered all at the same time, not knowing what they're doing. If any time this would be Christ on the cross saying, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing, that's exactly what we should do to ourselves right now in the current mess we're in. So what does this lead to? It leads to lots of things. But let me start with one of them. Every institution that was built on the previous paradigm will die. If you look at Paris in 1789, you will discover that the nobility and the church ladies and anybody else that was involved in Versailles at the time were more or less dead 10 years later. It's the same thing we're seeing right now. We're seeing We're seeing academia in crisis. We're seeing mass media in crisis. All of these old institutions are dying, and they're dying in front of us because the internet is killing every one of them, because the internet will do the same thing that they do, only less expensively so, and it also looks like it can solve the problems that politics and academia and industry cannot solve. We're beginning to discover that the ecological crisis of the planet can only be solved through the internet and through the collaboration of everybody on the planet, through sensors and senses everywhere being acutely aware of what is going on. We also have a problem with cosmopolitanism. For us all to get along on this planet, to understand languages we cannot speak, to be able to communicate freely between one another, to trade rather than to go to war, for all of these problems to be solved, we need the internet. We need the internet to figure out where every weapon of destruction on the planet might be at any given time, so we can lock in the atomic bombs, we can lock in the weapons of destruction, chemical and biological weapons. The only way to lock them in is by knowing exactly where they are. All of this will require that the satellites that operate above us start to behave like smaller gods serving humanity. So the internet might also be the only solution we have to the current predicament. I give an example of something very concrete here. Advertisers still think that we want ads. We hate advertising. Everybody I know, even old church ladies, have ad blockers these days. We have spam filters. We hate spam. We hate advertising. We hate being contacted with people we never wanted to talk to in the first place. And why? Because today, if you want to figure out something, if you want to find a product to buy, or a service we might purchase, or to make friends, or to go on a date, or to go out for a dinner, anything we'd like to do, even trying to figure out how we fend off the coronavirus and keep our own families and friends safe from the virus. All of these things we figure out online. And the way we figure them out is something called algorithms. And I'll tell you what, if the myth of yesterday or the magic of yesterday becomes the technology of tomorrow, algorithms are hopefully our guardian angels today. Because we all know that by using the algorithms, if we can keep them free and open, if we can keep the corruption of money away, if we can keep the manipulation of politics away, if we can keep the conformation of academics away from the algorithms, so the algorithms are free and open and reflect who we and our friends are, these algorithms can help us get through everything so we can find exactly what we're looking for online, and we can all, as human beings, be better and more informed than ever before in history. That is a fantastic opportunity, and we're already realizing it intuitively by turning off the ads. And what is advertising? Advertising and marketing is exactly what old institutions try to force on us, so we will listen to their crappy messages about their lousy products and about all the shit we never wanted to hear in the first place. I increasingly talk to young people that experience advertising as rape. I think it is. I think anybody who tries to advertise still today should be taken to court. When we think about the internet this way, we finally start to get the paradigmatics right. If we start to think about ourselves and how we operate as human beings, how we love our families, how we love the tribes we belong to, how we extend the clans into larger tribes, how we then even move into nations, have the same discourse. We meet in the same places online, discuss the same that we share, problems that need to be solved. All these things that we do as natural as human beings, when we try to extend our tribal identities to larger and larger populations to eventually maybe even cover the globe. All these things that we regular human beings nobly do are exactly the things that irritate the old institutions the most. That's what we need to invent, a new way of doing politics that has nothing to do with politics as we know it. We need to build new digital monasteries like we do already for knowledge, proper knowledge, instead of the old academics here. Is that we remove the ads from Google search every time we try to Google something. We discover that the algorithms present us with the people who didn't pay to be there in the first place, but simply the people who provided the best possible quality and who are the proudest of what they did. This is a golden opportunity to go into the global bazaar and present people with the best product at the best price. And you can compete on two different levels when it comes to the global bazaar we're walking into right now. You don't have to care whether you live in Latin America or North America or Europe or Asia or Africa or anywhere else, because online, everybody's there at zero cost. All it takes is creativity and some good social networking skills and loving people and being curiously interested in foreign and strange cultures that you can dig into so you learn more. And also not sitting in your own echo chamber, only listening to people who basically reinforce your own prejudices, but rather go out for something that I think is a beautiful philosophical concept called antagonia. Antagonia is an old Greek word for loving to be challenged at all times to thereby become more intelligent and become a larger, more expanded human being. If you're going to teach your children one thing right now, it is to enjoy the art of antagonia. Don't lock up yourself with people of your own prejudiced background. Rather, go out there in the world, learn languages, communicate with other cultures, learn as much as you possibly can, but always watch out for and love the person who challenges you, who with an opposed opposition. Love your opponent. This is more important than ever. It's also easier than ever. And once we learn the art of antagony, we'll all be better off. I would even say that it's the only thing that will give us a perfect class distinction of the new informationalist age, is that the people who always go for the opponent's view and love to be embraced by it are the ones that will be smarter than all the people who stay within the echo chambers and prejudiced forever. Okay, that means that if there is a global place out there where all of culture is thrown in, we're still humans. We still speak different languages. Even if the paradigm is becoming clear to us, we still have different territories. We still have physical neighbors. And when we come out of the corona fog, we will rediscover this in a whole new way. And I will suggest to you that instead of thinking as a physical world that is opposed to the digital realm, think of it as an augmented world. And a world of augmentation is a physical world that's still very physical to you, but it's now increasingly being augmented with all the increased value that digital can give to the physical realm. If you can merge digital and physical and understand them as a paradigmatic interplay with one another, then it's a whole new world opening up to us with whole new opportunities. And here's the beauty of it and the great benefit of being a Latin American. The one thing next to global that we'll be interested in will be local. We don't want the ads, but we still want two columns. We want the column of the global, and next we want the column of the local. I advise a lot of people coming out of business, especially people who work with technology, and I tell them this, really want to go for global, it's got to be fiendishly difficult to succeed. You better be an Uber or a Spotify or something else that adds value to people's lives you've never seen before. But if you do that on a global scale, your company will be present everywhere around the planet. But only a few companies and very few ideas can succeed on a global scale. But the beauty of this is that the other column is the local one. And Latin America has one enormous benefit. It's huge and local. It's all the way from northern Mexico. Well, you can include parts of the United States that I would consider as Latin American colonies. Certainly Florida is one of them. But let's say we start now humbly from the north of Mexico and go all the way down to Tierra del Fuego in the very south. This is a huge continent where people perfectly well understand one another. You can have your own startup in Mexico. You can all go all the way down to southern Argentina. You can run your own startup in Buenos Aires. You can all the way up to Mexico. And if I haven't misunderstood you guys completely, with some body language added to it, the Portuguese and the Spanish can understand each other pretty well. Otherwise, the Brazilians and the Argentinians wouldn't actually intermingle the way they do in Florianopolis every winter. This is the Latin America that I love. This is Latin America where I love to live my Scandinavian forest in the cold Swedish winter. Yes, I'm stuck here for the first time in 30 years due to the corona fog. Usually I love to be in Latin America in the Swedish winter because it's sunny and warm and full of beautiful, funny people that I can hang out with, just like you guys here. But Latin America, I mean, look at the paradigmatics of where the internet is going to end up. And I will remind you that Silicon Valley doesn't even understand what it's doing. The proper paradigmatics of the internet age might be understood by a few philosophers who figured this out 30 years ago, weren't listened to 30 years ago, weren't listened to 20 years ago, probably still aren't listened to today in 2020. All this increasingly becoming eerie that some people figured out 30 years ago, that if you focused on the human aspect of the internet rather than focused on the latest technology, you probably would understand the human to technology to human interface better than just focusing on the tech all the time. And this is my advice to all of you in Latin America. Yes, you have Mercado Libre. You have your startups that work really well. E-commerce has exploded from Mexico all the way down to Argentina over the last 10 months. This has been the smaller good news in the really big bad news of how the coronavirus has tragically affected Latin America. I'm very well aware of that. It exposes the weaknesses of the system. A coronavirus pandemic teaches us, slap in the face, what we as human beings must improve on precisely to create a better paradigmatics for the next time a pandemic hits us. That's what these pandemics do all the time throughout history. But I will remind you that in the simplest form, where all of us get up in the morning and turn on our laptops and our smartphones and go to the search engines to find our way through the mess called internet, to figure out what we prioritize that day in work, in spare time, for our family life, and for anything in our community that we care about. Contacting older people, contacting children, any relation that matters to human beings goes through algorithms. And the way algorithms will look 10 years from now, I make this one bet with you guys. I don't know how many pesos I get, if I get it right, if anyone wants to make a bet against me. But I can assure you that the simplest and most sufficient forms and most efficient forms of search engines will have an algorithms presented to us on our screens 10 years from now will only have two columns. One of them will be global, and it's called the world. And the other one will be called local, and it's called Latin America. Now, if that doesn't satisfy you enough to want to go out and start a tech startup or a philanthropy institution that starts digital monasteries, or starting a media channel where you and your friends can express yourself and talk to people you never thought you'd dare to talk to, to jump over the entire previous paradigm, forget about industrialization, forget about manufacturing, forget about all of that. Let somebody else do it. If you want to, you can outsource it. Move straight into the digital realm as we speak, and not just export soybeans and iron ore to the rest of the world, but Latin America could also be a force for good when it comes to understanding global versus local and presenting itself to the rest of the world. In that case, I expect to see a lot of Latin American names among the 50 or so names that I find in my global column 10 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Very interesting. I think that we have some questions here in Verb, and I would venture a first question. And I think that there's a big difference between this culture in Europe that produced books and printed and what we have now. Up to now, up to the 60s, revolutions consisted in changing something in the environment so that people would change. And I think that Huxley and George Orwell got it right when they said now revolutions consist in changing people directly. But this happens at the same time that we have this very public net of interconnectedness. And it seems so strange because we're using this public thing to enhance our own visions, our own interests. And what do you make of that? I mean, the internet revolution, I mean, the revolution of introduced by print in Europe never made people think that knowledge was in the books. Now we have people saying that knowing is obsolete and that knowledge is in the internet. I don't know. What do you make of that?
Well,
Can we overcome that?
Yeah, I think the religion that came out of the printing press, and I talk about religions all the time. I always say that we're all religious, but you talk about different religions here. The religion that came out of the printing press in Europe was something called individualism. The equivalent of that in the natural sciences is atomism. And just like atomism fell apart with quantum mechanics and gravity theory and everything else that we had in the 20th century, then also individualism has fallen apart. Don't tell the Americans just yet, because they're the ones that are stuck with it. They're stuck with individualism because it's basically the state religion of North America. The rest of the world has found out a long time ago that that was more like a parenthesis in history, because the true religion of human beings was always tribalism. We're essentially tribal. I always use the word tribal poesis for anything that starts among human beings. It always starts as something tribal. But the thing is that we overrate our own revolutions when we storm into the streets and run around and run amok and we think we know what we're doing. That's usually, to me, a symptom of something much deeper that's going on. That is why human revolutions are interesting. They're not really revolutions. They're symptoms of revolutions. The real revolutions are always, to me, technological. So dramatic technological changes, especially when it comes to communication technologies, how we store information, how we process information, how we create value out of that storage of that information. That is usually what runs everything else in any given society. So what I'm seeing now is that exactly when the paradigm shift happens, the only thing we can return to is what was deeply human in the first place. And that is why tribalism always returns at a time like this. But when we then leave individualism behind, we might go into bad tribalism or good tribalism. In that case, I would look at the current paradigmatics. This, for example, what I did during the speech when I said that if you sit isolated in your own echo chamber, only talking to people who share your own prejudices, you're going to be at the very bottom of society no time at all. Okay, but if you do go out there and you're antagonic in your approach, so you embrace different cultures and you learn from whatever they've studied, you'll be much smarter. This is a perfect example of good tribalism. This is different between a good tribe and a bad tribe. And I think it's better to talk about tribes today because that's easier for people to orientate themselves with. It's harder with empires, nations, larger systems. We might need a lot of help from AI to do those things, to operate larger systems, for example, with trade instead of war and things like that. But this is what we philosophers are working with at the moment. So how do we get out of the Western individualism that actually the rest of the world never believed in? You and I've been to India and China. We know they never believed in individualism in the first place. That's better for them right now because you don't want to get stuck in an old paradigm. That's exactly why Latin America should not focus on manufacturing any longer. It should move straight to digital. Keep farming and large-scale agriculture because it's been beneficial to the continent, but understand digital is a unique chance for Latin America to jump the paradigm straight into the future.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if you guys have a question. We have some few questions on the chat. And if Juan Pablo or Alfredo want to ask before
Yep.
I encourage people here to ask some questions while we have Alexander here.
Yeah, Alexander, thank you for your talk. Faith in terms of algorithms and in technology, obviously understanding which is obviously the main variable. Obviously, at the end, you have humans on the other side, and obviously, I was remembering the famous E.O. Wilson quote in terms of that the issue is we have this paleontologic emotions with medieval institutions and eventually godlike technology. But how do we manage with that mix? Obviously, we're seeing that obviously algorithm can bring us all this great things that we can find in terms of social media, but also it has in this cloud of fake news in which we don't know what the truth is or not. Obviously, someone is going to come up and eventually filter it and is going to be paid for it. But how do you deal with
No,
that?
wait. That's a good question right there. That's when it gets dangerous. I think Roberto and I agree on one thing that philosophers often arrive at through the hard way. Never try to change people. What we're seeing right now, what is scary, is that exactly the Jacobins of the current revolution are at the forefront of things. It's called woke culture in America. This is the attempt to change you. This is the attempt of pillar saints and little boy pharaohs and all these people who think that they deserve power and they should change you because you're evil or you're not what they want you to be. I think this is exactly what we need to watch out for the algorithms. There was something very interesting that happened right after the US election that I've been sort of prophesizing about for years. Because I worked with Google Ideas 10 years ago. I told them the value of the free and open algorithm. I would give speeches on it. These days, I work mostly with hackers in Europe and Asia because I love hackers, because they understand the value of free and open algorithm. And I always say that there are three threats to the free and open algorithm. It's the corruption of money that advertising tried to do. At least Google put the ad separate from the algorithm so we knew with a warning that these are the desperate guys that throw money at their problems instead of giving it the best possible product at the best time, which they should focus on. These are the bad guys that are not even allowed into the bazaar, so they're left outside the bazaar where they stand and shout at us. Just ignore them. That's how we ignore ads, right? So the corruption of money was a problem first. Now, these days, I would say the calm formation coming out of academics. Academics in North America and Europe have become incredibly conformed. Don't you dare speak differently. Don't you dare think differently, which is the exact opposite of what academia was supposed to be. Academia is now dead in Europe and North America because if you don't purchase or buy into the ideology of contemporary academia, you're basically banned and thrown out. This is called cancel culture. This is called deplatforming in Europe and North America. It's terrible. It's exactly what happened when the Jacobins took over France in 1792, and the bloodbath that followed was horrendous. It is precisely when we try to change other human beings. How dare we? What gives any human being the right to change somebody else? That right was never given by any god in any decent religion. It's only the Jacobins who take this right throughout history. And the major religions have always warned us about this pillar saint to sit in the forest and came in dressed as the wrong shaman, the false shaman. And they always have this message that they are superior to you. They're better human beings than you are. And because of that, they should be allowed to manipulate the algorithm so it fits their interest. What happened after the US election was incredibly interesting. Suddenly, there was a whole new subculture in North America of Christian Republican women from Texas. Okay, they might be pissed off that Trump lost the election, but they couldn't really care less because Trump wasn't their guy anyway. You don't care about those things. No, what they were obsessed about was that they figured out during the end of the election campaign that the big Silicon Valley tech companies were trying to distort their worldview by manipulating the algorithms so they should vote the way they were supposed to vote. But these are proper women matriarchs. They don't even care about how you try to manipulate them. They care about their children. What instantly started at the US election was Christian Republican women from Texas, knowing their own history, knowing that they escaped from, persecution in Europe to come to America, the land of the free, to have a weak government so they could, pursue their freedom, raise their kids as they thought best, practice a religion that they picked, not being changed by anybody. In front of God, having a relationship with God, but other than that, being allowed to be themselves in freedom. It's precisely this tradition in America that gives me hope for America today, because these women are now organizing themselves and saying, we're going to get our kids off Google, because Google is trying to fuck the brains of our kids, if I may be that literal. This is interesting. No, we got to live with the fake news for a while. Why? Well, we were always given fake news in the first place. It's not like the dictators of Chile and Paraguay and Venezuela gave you the proper news, did they, when you were Latin Americans? I think if anybody in the world knowing that the site of power will always give you fake news and try to manipulate you, well, you all know that. I think the internet is all about the free and open algorithm, but we got to fight for it. So these Jacobins that are trying to take over the internet today don't get their way.
So, but at the end, it's just a.
Let me drop in one. I want to give a chance for the audience to hand you a question. We have a couple.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions
from
here.
Kike and Manuela. They would like to see your perspective on the COVID pandemia and what you see for the future. And on the other hand, they would love for you to give us a further explanation on what antagony means.
Okay. When it comes to COVID-19, as things are right now, it's looking good for China and it's looking terrible for America. I was working here in a committee in Sweden in February when we decided the Swedish policy, which is pretty unique, but very scientifically oriented. But we knew we'd have to pull through the virus through the Swedish population, and we suffered quite bad here too. But I think in the long run, this was the only model we had an option for. China is a police state already. It's run like a dictatorship. And the Chinese will do everything they can once this is through, pointing out that officially maybe only 10,000 Chinese people died, although the virus originated from China, whereas over 1 million Americans probably will die before the vaccinations start to work. That is a very likely scenario. I predicted in February the United States, Brazil, and the United Kingdom were the 3 worst hit countries because they have bad health care. It's not evenly distributed in the population. They travel widely. They take tons of freedoms. They're hard to tell to stay indoors and wear face masks. And that's exactly what Brazilians, Americans, and English proved to me. So they got a mess. So in the short run, this will look like a really good deal for Xi Jinping, the dictator of China. That's exactly what my team here in Scandinavia are collaborating now with the East Asian countries, because the East Asian countries can prove to the world that they were equally successful in fighting this pandemic. They're therefore equally likely to be successful fighting the next one. And the numbers in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan are, if anything, better than anything coming out of China. That means that these countries have used all the sensors and all the data flows and all the data processing, both to develop vaccines to stop the virus from spreading with very low death rates and have been highly successful. And these countries are free and open. And we need to supply that story, that narrative to the world we're going to have in the next 2 years. As we sort of hopefully come out of the pandemic fog, we will also start appreciating so many other things in life. And maybe 3 years from now, we'll be much more concerned with the economic damage done by the virus than actually in how many people it killed. That's just human nature. That's probably will happen 3 to 5 years from now. But since the question was about the current state of COVID-19 and coming out of it from a narratively perspective, I would say that we got to watch out and hold the Chinese responsible. They were successful in fighting the virus. You cannot deny that. But any dictatorship police state would be expected to be successful in that department. But we can stand up to them and say, yes, but your neighbors in East Asia were the ones, not us, not Europe, Latin America, but your neighbors in East Asia with free and open society managed to fight the virus equally well. So the other question was the one of antagony. The antagony is a Greek word that I use in my work with John Söderqvist in our books. We will develop it further for the next book, because when people come and ask me, how do my children become successful in the future? I always tell them, well, capitalism is over in the sense that accumulating money is not going to make them any more successful in the future. Money will go to those who are successful with their attention. We're now living in an attentionless society. We're getting attention for what you do, and from the right people is actually the key to the success. Money will come to those who have the attention rather than you trying to raise money. So attentionalism formally shifted in 2012. Most people don't know this yet. We moved into an attentionalist stage. We left capitalism. Attentionalism has some very interesting qualities to it. It will force us to differentiate between the profane and the sacred in a whole new way that I'm thrilled about, because capitalism taught us that there are certain things you cannot buy, and those things are sacred to you. For example, you cannot buy your own children, right? So the things we love, we will never put on the market. That's what capitalism taught us. Attentionalism will even more teach us, even more firmly and brutally, that what is really valuable to us is something we need to keep to ourselves. We cannot just widely spread and be transparent about everything we do. The people that have been transparent on the internet the last 20 years are basically done and over with by now. They become rubbish and trash. They're mentally deluded by now. That's not, you can't do that. You can't do that with yourself. You've got to figure out who you're comfortable with, and you've got to create your own very isolated subcultures within which you feel comfortable. Then you can go public with certain things you do, like any bazaar trader ever would, but not with your family life, not with your most intimate things. This is a hard lesson that especially women are going to learn from the first 20 years of the internet age. So attentionalism is really interesting, but the real value there, if you want to give, if I just want to give you a simple tip, what to teach your children, is to teach your children to walk into a room with people with very opposing views of their own and be encouraged by it, and walk into that room with self-confidence, and your children will be winners. That's what antagony means.
Okay, so there's another question, a couple of questions by Mariana. And she asked, what do you make of online advertisement in the next 3 years? How is it going to sort out? And she asks another question, and what to make of the algorithms that are creating polarization in today's world.
The algorithms only reflect us human beings. Don't blame anything on the algorithms ever. Never blame anything on technology to begin with. Algorithms only reflect us. Capitalism reflected us. Why I don't participate in the traditional Marxist critique of capitalism is simply because capitalism was a force of truth. Force for good or not, that depends on us. But it forced us human beings to actually value everything we possibly could trade around the planet and give it an objective value, which is exactly what a currency does. I think we've got to live with that. We let the genie out of the bottle, and it did create enormous amounts of wealth for humanity. We weren't that good at splitting that wealth in between us, but it did. It's undeniably a fact. Attentionalism and the internet age will do the same thing, only more radically so. So that, I think, is the starting point we need to work from. Well, there was another question you addressed to Roberto as well.
Yes. He was asking about online advertisement in
Okay.
the next
Yes.
3 years.
Online advertising is dead. My most expensive speech professionally that costs about $20,000 if you want to buy it. I sell to German marketing people. This just exposes how masochistic Germans are. Okay, so I work in Germany, and my speech is called "Marketing is Dead, Get Over It," and I give it to marketing people, and they pay me $20,000 each time I do it. Yeah, it's a web, right? What I mean with that is that advertising is exactly what we hate the most from the capitalist paradigm. It's the one thing we want to get rid of, and I dare to call it mental rape. When I haven't asked for something, when there's something I've never asked to hear or see, then why should I go through it at all? That's what advertising essentially is. It tries to buy my attention. It tries to buy my ears, buy my eyes, buy my smell, buy my taste to consume something I never asked for in the first place and never needed. This is old industry to me. This is the remnants of a sort of male-run world that isn't female enough to understand that actually how human beings operate. If there's anything bad that feminism should have fought, then it should have fought against advertising. It's an old ghost we need to lock up and throw at the bottom of the ocean forever and forget about. To me, advertising is dying the way slavery died in the 19th century. We discovered it become redundant. We discovered it become expensive. We discovered it had been horrible all along. We discovered it was against anything in human nature that decides freedom and creativity. So we finally abandoned slavery and we never looked back ever since. It's the same thing with advertising. Advertising is the slavery of your senses. I think all human beings deserve to have free senses that don't need to pay through advertising for giving the attention to somebody in an artificial manner. And it forces everybody on the planet not to do fake news, which is what advertising is, but to communicate authentically. The advice I give to any company I talk to today is that the internet is there. You can create your own homepage. You can tell people what you do, not advertising. You can tell people what you do. Do it in a short, smart way. Don't be pompous or pretentious. Just tell it in the best way possible to people so they can understand what you're about. I give you an example of what will happen here in Europe. Once the corona fog has gone, I can assure you that two low budget airlines that everybody thought looked down on in the past, called Ryanair and Wizz Air, Ryanair operating out of Ireland, Wizz Air operating out of Hungary, will basically own the airspace of Europe. Why? Because these two companies never pretended that flying from one spot to the next one was a hilarious experience. No, they always told you that we're essentially transporting cattle. And when you fly your cattle, and we're going to transport used cattle from point A to point B, and we're not going to pretend we're doing anything else. Therefore, our homepage looks crappy, but we will transport you in the best possible way at the best possible price, and that's exactly why you will trust us. These airlines will own the airspace over Europe once this is over, and you probably see a similar pattern in Latin America. That is what I mean in the full extent of the paradigmatics of the death of advertising.
And following on that, Alexander, there's a question on that, but in your framework, if basically we're in an attentionless economy, or in which basically attention becomes the main currency.
Well, I would say it's not an economy. We got to skip the word economy. It's an attentionless society where social relations are attentionless, and economy can only be part of that society. So we got to skip the word economy here because that forces you back into capitalism, and that's the trap we try to avoid. It's an attentionless society.
Yes, but eventually you need to have some kind of currency in terms of assigning goods. So obviously it's and I think that eventually advertising, eventually if it is probably going to change as you do it before, there's going to be some way in which
You
basically people are
sound
going to
like
have
an
to.
old slave owner who's trying to save slavery here, Juan Pablo. Look back at the previous paradigm shift. This is my point. No, you're sounding like the guy sitting on the streets of Paris during the French Revolution, arguing that everything will still be about food when the revolution is over. And a clever philosopher by then, or a futurologist, would probably say, no, I even expect that the food production of the economy will be less than 5% 20 years from now. They might have shot that guy, put them in the guillotine, but he would be the one who was right. So we need to learn from previous paradigms. The economy, the economy part of human existence will be much smaller in the future than it's been in the past. And no, this is not about accumulating capital. This is not about making money, because you will not get into the most important social networks. You will not be successful in internet society by raising more money. You'll only be more successful in society by having more attention, and attention cannot be traded. This is why I'm writing books on religion and theology these days, because the only way to truly understand what attention is and why we human beings value it so enormously, and we're not willing to trade it for anything, not even for money, is a deeply religious matter that we need to look into. The economy will still be run, but it will run the same way that the farms were still run in the countryside. And Latin America was pretty successful in exporting soybeans to the rest of the world for a very long period. But you cannot seriously say that soybeans was the mainstay of the world economy as long as the economy was important. No, industry was way more important. And that's why the United States and Europe were more successful in Argentina at that game. But we need to get out of the whole idea that the economy now is the most important things to human beings, because it isn't. The most important things to human beings today is their calendar, and the calendar cannot be bought. That's what advertisers have to realize.
Let me hop in here. I think it's been a great conversation. The audience is really, really engaged. You have a lot of new fans, Alexander. Hope they will follow you in your social network. We have 10 minutes left, so let's wrap it up with a few more questions, please.
Okay, so let me take a look here. Manuela, she asked, but I don't understand. If advertising is dead or will die, how will industry inform people of new product? What will replace advertisement?
Those industries will die. This is like trying to save the people in Versailles, who are sitting in Versailles, putting their powders on each other's noses. And it's like Manuela is trying to save them. It's very human, right? You try to save the people in Versailles when actually everything that matters is happening in the streets of Paris. In the streets of Paris is where a new bourgeoisie who live in a city, in the urbanites. That's where they manifest their new power. These are the people who then create the industries of the world in the 19th century. They create the academics that replaces the churches of Europe as the stations of truth. They create political systems that make the monarchs obsolete. It's not your job, Manuela, to save old industry. Yes, I go into these companies all the time, and they give me their communication plans, and they throw their clever little communication plans to me, and they said, this is what we're going to communicate to the outside world. And I asked them, how? And they said, well, we just got to communicate it. How? Well, we'll advertise it. Nobody cares about ads any longer. We hate them. If you go to YouTube, and they force you to watch these ads if you haven't paid for it. Okay, a Finnish sociology team did an experiment last year. They started studying people who had to watch these YouTube ads because they hadn't paid for watching YouTube, so they took the free service. So the ads came up again and again and again. And you know that after 5 seconds, you can eliminate the ad? It turned out that out of 1,000 experiments, 992 times, people violently press the remove button after 5 seconds. That's how much people hate advertising. Now, if I'd be a man and I walked into a bar on a Friday night and 992 out of 1,000 women would come up to me and smack me in the face and spit me in my eyes, I would go home and hang myself. I think that's what industry and advertising should do. They're about as popular now as slave owners were in 1880. Get over it. We're finally through the period of history when advertising financed anything. And if a company today can run their own webpage and attract people who want to go there at their own free will and tip their friends about their products and their services, which is exactly what algorithms do. If a company can't just put a product out there that is so fantastic that people by word of mouth want to talk about it, it's a dead company. We don't go to restaurants any longer on Google Maps unless that restaurant has a 4.5 average grading. You go to Buenos Aires today or Lima today, you go into these amazing restaurants, especially in Peru, all these fantastic Peruvian restaurants. You don't go to any of these restaurants unless they got a 4.5 average grading from the average person who visited that restaurant. It's not even the number of people who went there. It's not the money spent. It is the quality of the dining experience itself that determines whether a restaurant will survive or not. And this will be the case for anything we human beings do for the next 30 years.
Okay, we have.
Manuela says, let me give you a comment on your answer, Alexander. Manuela says, I am so happy. My task is no longer saving the industry. Okay, but let me give you another question that we have right here. And Mariana asks, if attention is going to be the most important thing in society, then social media will never die.
No, social media will mature. A lot of women are discovering that spending time on Instagram wasn't worth the effort. Yeah, a lot of men are discovering that spending time on Twitter wasn't worth the effort. All these things mature. This is the great thing with us human beings. We learn collectively. We learn synchronically. We learn at the same time. No, social media will be around for the foreseeable future, possibly forever. We don't know yet. But the fact that we can interact with anybody anywhere in the world and make friends with anybody anywhere in the world is a fantastic opportunity. And that's what social media trains us to do. What we're tired of is people who use social media only as a megaphone to preach whatever they want to preach, or who just expose themselves and go increasingly desperate about the transparency, so therefore create some kind of attention. We call this fake attention. We call the phenomenon pornoflation. I think that's a good word in Spanish. That would be pornoflación. Pornoflación, I think, is an excellent word for people desperately try to do to get attention online. But that's when they go for fake attention. Because authentic attention is just try to stay true to yourself, focus on what you're good at, tell your own story exactly the way you could, in the most pedagogically smartest possible way. Like any good web page out there you see these days. Any web page you want to go back to and visit again because you had a great experience in using it. That is good attention. Bad attention, that's just desperately trying to go for attention all the time. And we know what we do with bad attention. We throw it in the spam box and we don't ever want to see it again. We basically block it, as we should.
Okay.
Well, Alexander, it's been great. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. Obviously, we could spend here hours, and obviously we'll continue the dialogue afterwards. But thank you so much. We hope you accompany us in this project going forward. I know you should, you would. And thanks again.
Yeah, it's okay. This is the first time in 30 years I'm spending the winter in dark, cold Scandinavia, but I'm dying to go back to Latin America and spend my next winter there, I assure you.
Okay.
Next.
You were saying? Well, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank
everybody.
you. Good luck with the conference.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, everybody in the audience, for being with us. Hope you enjoyed. See you soon. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.